My daughter-in-law's laughter cut through my own living room, her glass of wine raised like a trophy, while I stood there with trembling hands over the coffee tray. Yet what none of them knew was that the same night I would open a folder that would turn their arrogance into my weapon. Before I continue, subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're listening. If this story resonates with you, please share it. The more people know, the fewer grandparents will have to pay for someone else's trust. They were in my living room when the laughter landed like a slap I couldn't lift a hand to block. The china cups rattled on the coffee table, and the smell of dark roast and orange furniture polish mixed in the air, while my son's friends leaned back on the couch I had paid for and smirked. My daughter-in-law tossed her hair toward them and made a joke about me that folded the room into easy cruelty. She didn't say grandfather. She said something closer to a walking bank with a pulse. The kind of line that draws safe laughter because it hides under the costume of humor. My son let out a sound that used to be his boyish laugh and now lived somewhere harder. No one noticed how the steam drifted from the spout of my old steel kettle like a little ghost trying to leave the scene. I set the tray down and felt the tremor in my hands before the cups did. My house kept giving itself away. The old oak floor groaning under new shoes, the wall clock over the mantel ticking loud like a metronome guiding my breath. On the mantel, my wife's photograph watched with polite patience. The same patience she used to have at church when someone talked out of turn and she chose to forgive them in silence. The photo sat beside her blue glass bottle, the one we bought at a flea market in '82, because she liked the way sun broke through it and scattered cheap stars over the wall. Her bottle caught that afternoon light and broke it up again, throwing little patches of blue over everything that mattered to me. The frame, the clock, the edge of a letter she wrote long ago, the ridges on the wooden coffee table my hands had refinished every spring. Sun pushed through the afternoon and slid gold along the hallway. The laughter moved to the front porch where a breeze carried whiffs of cut grass from my neighbor's yard. The group rattled on about restaurants, gyms, and a boutique opening, and my son's voice got stronger when he named prices. I collected plates, rinsed them under warm water, and watched coffee grounds whirl down the drain like dirty galaxies. My granddaughter slipped a folded scrap of paper into my palm while I reached for the dishcloth. She didn't look at me when she did it. Her hand was small and dry and steady. I felt the square of paper bump against my lifeline, and I tucked it beneath the cuff of my sleeve as if it were a pill I wanted to keep secret. The afternoon settled on its heels and became evening without clearing its throat. People said their goodbyes with that quick compression of lips that is not a kiss and not a smile either. And the front door breathed in and out on its hinges until the street was quiet again. My son left last. He walked past the photograph on the mantel and didn't look. He was thinking about weekend plans and a new insurance bill and how to keep his wife impressed. He brushed the side of my arm with his knuckles, the way he did when he needed me to feel like we had touched. I went out to the porch to wave at a car that did not turn around. The cicadas had begun their evening chorus, that saw-like rasp in the trees that used to make my wife laugh because she said they sounded like old men sharpening stories. Back inside, the house exhaled. I stood in the hallway and listened to the quiet glow through the rooms, the way light lingers in a place after company leaves, like warm air trapped in blankets. The smell of coffee had shifted to the smell of old wood that has seen soap and water and time. I ran a dishcloth over rings on the coffee table and watched them fade the way bruises do. I sat on the edge of the armchair that still held the shape of my wife's hips if you believed hard enough. My granddaughter had curled herself into the window seat again, her pencil moving. She looked over at me with eyes that were not yet trained to look away from pain.
She lifted a corner of her sketchbook, just to peep, so I could catch what she was drawing. A little house with a blue bottle in the window and a man standing inside it, holding something that looked like a folder to his chest. She had drawn him with his chin up. I opened my palm and unfolded the square of paper she'd pressed there. It was a simple thing, ink pressed into cheap notebook lines, but it made a shape inside me I hadn't felt in a long time. I didn't need to read it again and again to understand it. It said I wasn't a bank. It said I was a person. It said there was at least one set of eyes in that house that saw me as more than a wallet and a warm body. I placed the note inside the hollow of the blue glass bottle, where my wife would have put a flower stem, and the paper caught the last light and glowed for a second like a tiny lantern. The first thing to do after any ambush is to take inventory. Not inventory of objects, but of truths you can stand on and still breathe. I walked to the bedroom I had shared for 43 years and pulled open the bottom drawer of my dresser. Cedar scent rose up from the old wood, steady and clean. Sheets of tissue paper crackled like thin ice. Under the sweaters and the shoebox of photographs, I reached for the blue folder. People save different things. I save paper. Paper does not argue. It sits there with dates and numbers and the courage of ink. This folder had all the practical weight my wife used to carry with a day planner and a pen behind her ear. She had laughed that I was the sentimental one and she was the archivist. But ever since she left, I had learned to be both.
I set the blue folder on the bedspread and ran my palm over it, the same way I used to smooth the crown of my boy's head when he fell asleep in the back seat after a long drive to the shore. The cardboard was worn at the corners where my thumb had turned it 100 times. The clasp was bent from years of opening and closing. Inside was our history, as told by numbers and contracts and letters with the old silver return address labels that still had her name on them. There were tax returns with staples that caught my nail, insurance policies that smelled faintly of printer ink, and bank statements whose paper was thin as skin. Tucked among them were a few of her notes, the small, neat handwriting that made even grocery lists look like invitations. The house clicked and settled around me, boards cooling as evening dropped. Outside the window, the first stars took their positions over the maple tree, the one she planted as a sapling the year our son started kindergarten. The furnace fan kicked on, sending a low breath through the vent by my ankle. The clock in the hallway kept time like a drummer in the back row. I opened the folder and began turning pages. It is a particular kind of ache to watch your life parade past in line items. There was the rent I covered when my son's job fell through and he said he would pay me back soon. There were the notes where I wrote the months and the amounts and then stopped writing the word loan because the word had become a lie. There were receipts from places I never ate, dates that lined up with photographs of smiling faces in restaurants where I would not have known which fork to pick up first. There were flights I purchased to celebrate their milestones, and there were groceries I did not buy for myself because I figured the healthy thing I needed more than fruit was to not make trouble. There were memberships to gyms and streaming services I never logged into. I watched these things flicker by and felt not rage first, but a strange kind of tiredness that started in my shoulders and settled behind my eyes. I remember the first time my wife and I had sat at this very spot with a different folder, the one for our first mortgage. She had tapped the table with her knuckle and told me we would pay it together because that is what a team does. And she had smiled in that way that made me want to outlive her by a week so I could close the last lights myself and know I had put everything in order before I locked the door. She had not given me that week. She had given me years that felt like the inside of a bell, clear, ringing, held.
When she died, I had promised her picture I would take care of our boy. I had not imagined I would mistake taking care for carrying. I sorted the statements into piles, the way a man sorts screws in a coffee can on a workbench. This size, that size, missing heads. My fingers moved in their old right way, even while my chest worked through the new hurt. My granddaughter's footsteps went soft, soft across the hall as she went to brush her teeth, and the bathroom light made a warm bar of yellow under the door. She would sleep in the guest room tonight because Mondays are school mornings and her mother has the early shift. She never complains about the guest bed because she says the quilt smells like my wife's perfume, even though the bottle has been dry for years. I could not smell it anymore. I smelled only paper and the faint sweetness of the cedar drawer and the lemon oil I used on the dresser last week, because I still do the small things that say a house is alive. When the piles were tidy and I had found the pattern again, I reached for the newest envelope. It had come in that morning's mail with the rest of the week's weight. I hadn't opened it earlier because I had been busy playing host, a role that now felt like a costume that squeezes a man a little too tight under the arms. The envelope had the bank's logo embossed on it, and that cold, efficient window where my name floats behind plastic like a fish you can't quite touch. I slid a finger under the seal and freed the contents with a whisper that sounded like someone smoothing a dress over their knees, which is to say something gentle.
The statement was crisp. The font was the same one I had seen all my adult life, steady and unashamed. I scanned the lines with the slow training of a man who has balanced checkbooks when calculators still clicked. There were expected debits that matched the rhythm of my life: utilities, pharmacy, the hardware store where I like to talk varnish with the kid who knows lumber by taste. Then came items that felt like pebbles in a shoe: a boutique whose shopping bags arrive with ribbon, a membership with a monthly fee that would buy a week of groceries for one person who keeps their meals simple, a luxury gym whose logo is stamped on water bottles I have seen in my daughter-in-law's photos. I knew most of these by now. They had become familiar in the same way pain becomes familiar if you do not address it. I turned the page and my breath picked up. The numbers were small enough to hide in the folds of a budget, but the pattern had changed. The date was not last month, it was this week. The category line included a service I had not seen before, tied to authorized users and new cards. I traced the digits with the tip of my finger and felt the skin of my thumb snag on the paper's edge. It was not the money that made my stomach harden. It was the fact that I had asked, gently and then less gently, for boundaries. It was the fact that a joke about me had been told in my own house on the same day a new withdrawal had been made without my knowledge. Evening had turned to night without ceremony. The street lamps cast pale circles like coins dropped on the sidewalk outside. The crickets pushed on with their scrape-scrape, and a neighbor's dog gave a half-hearted bark and then sighed back into his bed. I could hear my granddaughter's sleep when I paused for it, the small wind of her breathing under a quilt paired with the occasional page-turn whisper as she finished whatever chapter she was in. That small wind is the sound that keeps me alive. It is why a man cooks for himself when he would not otherwise bother, why he takes his pills on time, why he locks the back gate. I lifted the folder and felt how heavy paper can be when it is telling the truth you have been trying not to hear. The blue color had faded where the sun sometimes found it on the bed in the afternoon.
My wife's handwriting peered at me from a note clipped inside, a grocery list from years ago with almonds and dish soap and tulips. She had loved to put flowers in that blue bottle and watch the light move through them. She had loved to balance checkbooks more than she loved roses. She had loved me. That last truth has a temperature you do not forget. It warmed the room enough for me to stand up straighter. I put the folder under my arm the way a man tucks a newspaper on his way to the porch. I walked to the living room and set it on the coffee table where the rings had been. The note in the blue bottle winked at me from inside its glass throat. The clock ticked. The house listened. Somewhere a car rolled by like a wave and then left me in my own tide again. I thought of every time I had chosen peace at the price of a boundary. I thought of how my son had learned to speak in numbers the way men speak in weather, casual, inevitable, outside of his control. I thought of how a boy watches his father's hands and learns to copy their movements like a second language. He had watched me give. He had copied the taking. I did not make any grand decisions on that couch. I counted my breaths and kept my palms flat on my knees. I let the hurt flow through me the way a storm moves across a field. Inside the hurt was an old thing that was not anger, but something sturdier, the memory of doing right by the people I had been given. That memory could be turned sideways and used as a blade, or it could be laid flat and used as a plank. Tonight, I did not pick it up either way. I set it on the table beside the folder and let it be what it was, proof that I am not a bank, but a man. The refrigerator clicked again, and the house felt for a moment like it used to, alive with two equal hearts.
I return to the statement because paper is faithful. It repeats what it has to say until the reader accepts the lesson. I handled pages carefully so as not to put stress on the tears that had started at the hole-punched edges. I found the section on authorizations and cross-checked with an old page I knew by memory. The bank had changed the language, but the meaning was the same. Someone had added themselves again. Someone had found a crack I thought I had sealed with a request months ago. Someone had looked at me today and called me a joke, and then gone home and made me into one on paper as well. In the kitchen, the red light on the answering machine blinked lazily, a heartbeat for messages I did not want yet. The porch light drew a gentle cone on the steps and picked out a moth's dusty wings. The blue bottle sat on the mantel and held the note at a tilt so that it looked like a little sail catching wind from a world inside the glass. I found my wife's letter at the bottom of the folder, the one she wrote me before a minor surgery years back, when we thought being careful with words might be a good blessing to leave just in case. She had written about dignity. She had written about how love without boundaries is not love but self-erasure. She had written about our boy and how we must never let our help become his habit. I had saved the letter like a talisman and ignored the spell. I read it and felt my throat close around air that had become too big for my chest. I gathered the papers into a neat stack and fastened the clasp with the dull clink of metal on itself, then slid my hand under the last page to make sure no smaller slip had hidden itself there. The paper rasped mightily, and something caught against my fingertip, a card-shaped envelope I had not noticed a moment before because it was tucked to the back, with its activation sticker still clinging, and a date on it so fresh it felt like it was still drying. And there, in a line of black print clean as a knife,
was my name attached to an additional card I had never requested. The activation sticker flashed under the lamp like a tiny square of ice, and for a second I felt the cold in my palm. The card was slick and new, my name printed clean in black, the bank's logo embossed like a seal of approval on a story I had not written. The house breathed around me. Crickets scored lines in the night. The clock in the hall kept its faithful tick, and the blue bottle on the mantel held the little note my granddaughter had pressed into my hand earlier, its corners catching a sliver of lamplight so it looked like a folded sail in a glass sea. I laid the card on the blue folder and stared at the parent, my past under my poem, my present on top of it, plastic and simple and shameless. The old ache rose and shifted into something steadier. It wasn't anger boomeranging around the room anymore. It was air filling my lungs, deliberate and measured. A man needs something solid to push against, even if that something is the truth sitting on his coffee table with his name stamped across it. Somewhere in the house, a pipe gave a quick knock, like a knuckle on wood, and then all I could hear was the low hum of the refrigerator and the faint sleep sigh of my granddaughter down the hall. There are moments when a life turns and no one outside the room would mark 'em if they passed by the window. Mine turned with the sound of my own feet on the hall runner. The carpet still had a groove in it from my wife's habit of standing in that exact spot with the phone tucked under her chin while she wrote notes on the pad pinned to the wall. I ran my fingers over the nail holes where the pad used to hang. Then I went to my study and woke the old computer with 2 taps on the space bar. The screen blinked awake like a reluctant eye and washed the room in a cheap blue light that made the paper edges glow. The smell in the study was books and dust and faint lemon from last week's polish. When the tower fan kicked on, it pushed a ribbon of cool air past my knees. My chair complained under my weight the way it always did, a comfortable complaint, known and forgiving. I typed the bank's address into the bar and felt the keys answer my fingers like a familiar piano. My password was long because my wife had insisted on long passwords when long passwords were new and annoying. I could still hear her voice telling me to put a phrase in there I would remember, even if my mind slipped. I wrote a sentence about the day we planted the maple, and that sentence has kept me safe for years. Two-factor authentication demanded a code, a little 6-digit gate that suddenly felt like the last decent boundary I had left with my name on it. My phone buzzed on the desk, the old case scratched and familiar, and the code came, and I let myself in. The bank's site unfolded itself like a long hallway with doors, accounts, cards, transfers. I had clicked through these screens 1,000 times, soft, forgiving choices, the way a father chooses not to add up small things, because he trusts the large thing, love, family, the promises we make when the table is crowded and the lights are warm. I started where it hurt. The list of authorized users looked back at me like a family portrait where half the faces had their eyes on someone else's pocket. I clicked into the card with my name and the new line that had appeared this week, and there it was. Another card issued, a digital copy waiting, a little green check mark that might as well have been a grin. My hand didn't shake. The shaking had done its work earlier. Now the steadiness came and sat down beside me like an old friend who doesn't talk, just sets a hand on your shoulder and gives weight to your bones. Remove user. The phrase looked small on the screen. I hovered over it long enough to feel the history crowd behind me, Christmases where I was alone with leftovers while photos from a rooftop party showed up on my phone, birthdays that came with receipts tucked into cards, texts that began with, "Dad, quick question," and ended with my wallet lighter and my heart careful not to bruise itself on the word no. I clicked. A confirmation box bloomed, polite and chilly, and I clicked again.
The card shifted from active to canceled with a tidy animation that was almost smug. I moved to the next one. The cursor became a metronome for my pulse. Remove, confirm, remove, confirm. I went into the transfers next. The automatic drip I had set years ago to help them get on their feet had become a hose that never shut off. The bank dressed it up and scheduled as if it were a responsible thing, a mark of a man with a plan. I had been a man with a plan. It just wasn't mine anymore. I canceled the repeating transfer to the account we had called emergency because the emergencies had learned to wear perfume and shoes. I watched the schedule clear itself like a chalkboard after a hard lesson. I changed my online password, and then the password to the email that guarded my password, and then the locking phrase on my phone. At some point, I realized the fan was drying tears I hadn't felt slide down. They left cool tracks on my cheeks and vanished almost as soon as they formed, like rain on hot pavement. The screen threw up a message that said I might receive a call from the bank to confirm the activity. I pictured a stranger in a cubicle reading a note aloud about unusual changes and felt a brief rush of weary laughter. Unusual is a word for a new haircut, not for a man deciding not to be robbed with his blessing. I printed copies of the confirmations because paper has a weight digital screens do not. The printer clacked and warmed and spit out sheets that smelled of hot toner and plastic, a little cloud of industry in my small room. I slipped those pages into the blue folder with the care of a man laying a blanket over a sleeping child.
The night carried me into morning slowly, like a ferry crossing a black river. I made coffee because coffee makes a sound that tells a person they're not done yet. The machine gurgled and sighed and filled the kitchen with that scorched, sweet smell that has walked me through 1,000 dawns. The window over the sink shifted from slate to blue, and the maple outside became a shape again instead of an idea. I traced the grain of the cutting board with my thumb while the pot filled, thinking about all the little humiliations I had let land on me because they came in small feathers, never as a stone. The ask at the door with a shrug and a smile, the joke at Thanksgiving that everyone pretended was affectionate, the receipt tucked in a card with a note that said, "We'll pay you back next week," and the exceptional hangdog look the following week when they did not. My granddaughter padded into the kitchen on bare feet, hair messy, shoulders hunched into one of my wife's old sweaters that she steals for its comfort. She didn't ask anything first. She stepped close and put her arms around my waist. I felt her cheek press into my rib cage. Her hug had the warmth of an honest day. We stood like that a long time without words because words would have broken something. Then she pulled away and took 2 mugs from the cabinet. She poured mine and then poured her cocoa, and we doctored both with too much sugar. She took a sip, winced, and then smiled exactly like her grandmother used to smile whenever she made a mistake on purpose to keep another person from feeling alone. She looked at the blue folder on the table and touched the corner of it as if asking permission. I nodded. She didn't open it. She just rested her fingers there, like you would rest them on a piano lid before leaving the room. She said she had a math test in 3rd period, and I said she was good at math, which is true, and she said being good doesn't stop your stomach from doing the jitterbug anyway. Then she went to pack her lunch, and I watched her add an apple and a sandwich in neat layers, and then pause and slide an extra cookie in the bag, looking over her shoulder like a thief, as gentle as rain. She put the bag by the door and came back for another quick hug, her cheek cool now and smelling faintly of toothpaste, and then she left a little drawing on the table for me, a blue bottle with a paper light inside it. After she left, the house returned to its small noises, the drip in the bathroom that means the flapper will need replacing, the creak in the hall where the board lifts if you step on it wrong, the low, distant thrum of garbage trucks waking the street. I sat with my coffee and looked at my hands.
They were my father's hands, after all, heavy and lined, the fingers squared off from decades of making and mending. Those hands had rocked a baby and pushed a mower and flipped pancakes and learned how to press a password key with the same careful firmness used to seat a nail without splitting the wood. I laid them flat on either side of the blue folder and breathed. The phone rang at 9:15, right on the nose, as if someone had scheduled my punishment on a calendar. The sound was the ordinary bubble of its tone, but it filled the kitchen as if a brass band had come through the door. His name was on the screen. I let it ring twice and then lifted it. His voice was already high at the edges, the way it gets when embarrassment wears him like a fever. He spoke fast and stacked words on top of each other. They were at a restaurant. They had taken Dana's mother for lunch. The waiter was waiting. The manager had already come by twice, polite the first time, less so the second. The card didn't work. The second card didn't work either. The app said declined. What was going on? Was I okay? Was I at home? Could I fix it quickly because people were looking?
I told him the same way I had clicked earlier, without shaking. I told him the cards were canceled, the transfers stopped, the authorizations removed. I told him I was no longer financing their lifestyle. The sentence felt like a beam locking into place in a frame that had listed too long. On the other end, I heard silence that sounded like a hand pressed over the mouthpiece. Then there was a muffled rush of another voice and the scrape of a chair and the high, thin note that is panic when it is trying to be polite in public. He said we could talk later, but for now, could I turn just one thing back on, just for today, just to avoid a scene? I told him I'd already had my scene yesterday, and it had taken place in my own living room. He tried other doors. He asked if I was ill. He suggested I had misunderstood. He held up my love like a mirror and asked if I could see myself in it and recognize the old me. He mentioned the word family, the way you might mention scripture to a lapsed believer. He said Dana's mother was right there looking at him, and what was he supposed to do? I told him he was supposed to be a grown man in a restaurant. He said he would pay me back on Friday. Friday has come and gone so many times in my house that the day has teeth marks on it. I told him no. I hung up before the sound of his pleading could replace the sound of my own steady breath. The calls kept coming. First his again, then hers, then a number I didn't recognize, but I knew who it belonged to by the tone of its persistence. I let them fall into the machine and blinked their red light at me like a heartbeat I didn't need to monitor. I washed my cup, dried it, and set it upside down on the rack. I wiped the counter in long strokes until the lemon smell replaced the coffee. I sat at the table and opened the blue folder to the printouts I'd made, and I let my eyes rest on the words as if I were reading scripture in a stubborn pew, patient, steady, refusing to be moved by a choir at the wrong time. The tires sounded in my driveway before noon, a quick crunch of gravel like a jaw clenching. Car doors slammed, two in tight succession, the second one harder than the first. The front bell rang, and then the knocking started. Polite at first, a polite that carries within it a promise of escalation. I didn't move. My bones asked me to, a reflex older than my gray, but I didn't. I sat in the back of the house, on the little porch off the kitchen, the one with the wooden steps I had sanded and resealed last spring, and let the sun warm the boards under my bare feet. The maple threw a patterned shade over the yard, stained glass without the church. A sparrow hopped along the fence and scolded something only he could see. The knocking grew louder, fists now, not fingers. Then a flat palm slap that made the old oak door ring in its frame. My wife chose that door from the salvage yard, solid as a promise, and I had sanded it down and rubbed oil into it until it drank the light like it had been starving. It used to smell like linseed and honey on warm days. Today it smelled like wood, plain and dignified. The bell rang again, and again, then the pebbly thud of a heel joined the rhythm. I could hear their voices through the house,
the words traveling through the runs of old ductwork like a radio in another room. My name, first with sweetness, then with the thin sharpness that comes when sweetness doesn't fetch. They tried to side window. They tried jokes. They tried calling in, telling me they knew I was home. I listened to my breath move in and out like the tide under a duck.
They switched strategies to the one I knew best, concern. Are you okay? Is something wrong? You're not yourself. Please talk to us. People are noticing. The part of me that had been father and fixer for so long reached for the door handle out of habit, the way a tongue reaches for a missing tooth. And that same part sat back down because the hand on my knee was heavier than the habit in my wrist. The blue folder lay on the porch table beside a small pot of rosemary that my granddaughter had planted, and the herb pushed its sour green scent up into the heat, clean and simple. That smell brought my wife back for a second. The kitchen in summer, chicken on the stove, her humming half a song while she rubbed a sprig between her fingers and smiled because it made the whole room better than it had been a moment before. The voices outside ran through their colors, pleading, reasoning, accusing. My son's voice dropped to the bare-bones tone he uses when he thinks I am being stubborn for sport. He told me we could discuss boundaries. He said he understood why I might be upset. He asked me to visualize his face, how stressed he was, how much he needed me right now. My name wore out in his mouth and became Dad again for a minute, and then it became the same syllable he used when he was 6 and his kite tangled in the highest branches. I did not open the door then either. The kite had come down eventually, the lesson had not. Then her voice rose clean above his. It was the voice she uses when she speaks to a hostess or a sales clerk or a teacher. Performative friendliness, heavy with sugar, as if the sweetness itself were a kind of payment. She said she was sorry if her joke yesterday had offended me. She said we all say silly things among friends. She said mothers-in-law are special and she had meant it as a playful nudge. The word playful slid under the door and schemed to make me feel humorless. I let it slide back out with the breeze. She pivoted quickly to concern about my health. Had I seen my doctor? Had I perhaps forgotten things lately that I didn't want to admit? The suggestion hung there like a fruit I was supposed to pluck and present to them as proof that I needed help with the household. Then she hardened, the way a lake hardens in a cold snap, and the syllables came with a crack in them. The banging picked up, fast and childish. My name was no longer a request, it was a demand. The maple shook a little wind out of its sleeves and sprinkled shade over the porch. I watched a spider rebuild a web in the corner above the screen door, her legs moving in a simple geometry that no amount of human noise could interrupt. My phone buzzed on the table. A text came in, long enough that my old screen couldn't show it all at once, a glossy paragraph that pretended to be olive branch and read like ledger. I put the phone face down. A moth tapped the screen twice and then changed its mind and moved toward the rosemary instead. My granddaughter's drawing lay half under the blue folder, blue on blue, a bottle in a bottle, paper catching light. I got up once to refill my water and heard the sound of my son's foot hit the door hard enough to make the wood give a dull pain. The frame held, the hinges breathed. The house remembered what it was built for, to stand, to shelter, to witness. I came back out and sat again, knees a little stiff in the heat. Sweat ran down between my shoulder blades and stuck my shirt to my back. Outside, a neighbor's mower started, and fresh-cut grass moved across the air like a green hand. For a moment, a memory stepped into the smell.
A July morning with my wife's hair pinned up and her bare feet on the kitchen tile as she lifted the lid on a simmering pot and smiled at me like we were still 20 and immortal. The ache that memory carried was not the kind that bends a man. It's the kind that straightens him.
When the knocking slowed, their voices sharpened. They stepped away from persuasion and into shame. They mentioned the restaurant again, the bill, the way people had looked at them. They said the manager had asked them to step outside the foyer, that Dana's mother had to pay, that cameras were everywhere these days, and did I want that? The words weren't about me anymore, not really. They were about their image, their frame, the story they needed to stitch back together before it tore in public. Behind their words rode the quiet assumption that my role was to prevent their discomfort. That assumption had lived in my hall closet for 10 years with the umbrellas and the old coats. Today, I had opened the door and asked it to leave. The afternoon pooled around us. Sweat made little loops in the dust on my forearms. A fly tested the rim of my glass and then reconsidered. The bell rang again, long and rude, and a voice I did not recognize added itself to the mix, older, female, crisp. The soggy phrase, "family matter," drifted through the wood. I did not answer. The heat made their patience thin, and I could feel the whiplash coming before it arrived, the way you can sense a storm turning even if the sky insists on blue. It came the way it always comes, when sweetness fails, and shame fails, and pity fails. Clean, sharp, dressed up like advice but carrying a blade. And I heard her say through my own front window, level and almost satisfied, that if I didn't open the door and stop this nonsense, they would get a lawyer and have me declared incompetent. The voice slid through my own window like a knife kept in velvet. If you don't open this door and stop this nonsense, we'll get a lawyer and have you declared incompetent. The words hung in my kitchen air with the smell of rosemary and lemon oil, heavy, sour, metallic. The old oak door took another sharp knock and shivered in its frame. The maple outside sifted light over the porch boards, and somewhere a lawnmower coughed to life and then steadied into its green drone. I could hear my son say my name in a lower register, warning and pleading braided together, and then I heard her again, that shiny voice turned flat as a ruler. Something inside me tightened and then set, like a knot pulled hard enough to hold. Fear didn't blow me over. It sat down beside me with its arm around my shoulders and made me breathe slower, the way a coach does with a rookie who's gone white at the free throw line. I fixed my eyes on the blue folder on the table and on the glass throat of the blue bottle on the mantel. My granddaughter's little note shone inside the bottle like a paper lantern that refused to go out, even with voices outside trying to draft a storm. My wife's photograph kept its patient watch. For a second I felt the old tug, the one that tells a man to open the door and step into whatever story the loudest voice is telling. And then I let my hand rest on the folder. The cardboard was warm from the sun and from my own palm. The feel of it steadied me. The knocking changed, lost its rhythm, and then faded into footsteps on the porch. Sharp voices and a whisper, a car door thunk, another one, engine turning, gravel crunching as if the driveway were grinding its own teeth. Silence took its proper shape again. I sat still and listened to the house breathe, the refrigerator's low hum, the soft click of cooling wood where afternoon gives in to shade, the muffled plumbing cluck that might as well be a heartbeat. I could feel my own pulse in the notch under my jaw. It was not running, it was working. My granddaughter would be in third period now, tapping a pencil on a desk that wobbles and trying to get fractions to behave. She had left a drawing on the table this morning of a bottle catching light. When I tucked the blue folder under my arm, the drawing slid under it as if it belonged there, blue on blue.
I tucked it into the inside pocket of my jacket, the way a man tucks a photograph against his heart when he has to carry something through weather.
I rose. The chairs scrape loud in the quiet kitchen. I put one hand flat on the table the way my wife used to do before she said something she knew would change the shape of a day. Then I picked up the folder and my keys. The metal felt cool. My hand was dry. I didn't look at the front door as I passed it. I looked at the photographs on the hall wall, the school pictures with their 2 blue backgrounds, the wedding portrait where my wife's dress turned the room's air into a softer thing. I put my ear to the door out of habit and heard only my own house. Good. Outside, the heat had laid itself over the street like a tired dog. The sky had that washed cotton look it gets when the day means to be hot and has nothing to offer but a hard light. I locked the door, checked it twice, and walked down the steps. There was a scuff on the 3rd tread where a heel had hit it earlier. I bent and ran my finger over the bruise in the wood and felt a quiet flare of anger that didn't fling itself around the room. It just burned clean for a second and then stored itself somewhere useful. The truck's cab smelled like old coffee and dust and the pine trees I've hauled home more Decembers than I care to count. I slid the folder onto the passenger seat and it leaned against the backrest like a second rider. When I turned the key, the engine gave me that familiar throat clearing and then settled. The maple flashed past the windshield as I backed out, and the blue of the bottle on the mantel flashed back from inside. A tiny sky I got to take with me in my head. Driving has always been a moving kind of prayer for me. The road tucks under your tires in long brown ribbons. The ditches carry a private commentary in weeds and wrappers and wildflowers that refuse to mind the mower, and the world shakes itself into pieces you can swallow. I ran the names in my head like a rosary. My son, as I had known him at 10, gentle hands and a cowlick that wouldn't obey. My wife at 28 with flour on her cheek, telling me to stop eating cookie dough and let the tray get to the oven. My granddaughter's quiet, stubborn kindness. The threat that had just been thrown through my window was not new. It had been implied before, drawn like a chalk line around me. Today, it had been spoken. Spoken things can be answered. The law office sits in a brick building that used to be a bank when I was a boy, back when bank lobbies smelled like coins and leather and grown men's hair oil. Now the lobby smells like copy toner and brewed coffee that's been sitting 4 hours too long. The carpet has a pattern meant to be ignored, and the fern in the corner has been replaced twice this year already, because ferns are sensitive to everything. The receptionist wore a cardigan, even though the air had that museum cool that makes paper happy and people cold. She smiled with her lips and asked if I had an appointment, and I said I had a problem I didn't intend to carry home. It turned out a cancellation had left a gap. The lawyer saw me sooner than a man with my hat in his hands often gets seen. His office had 2 windows and a view of the parking lot and a framed diploma that he probably dusted himself. There was a coffee ring under his coaster because everyone fails their own rules now and then. He shook my hand like a person who remembers hands, not just screens. He called me by name and asked me to tell him what was happening. And I did. Not with all the colored thread of 30 years of marriage and loss and parenthood, just the straight rope of what had occurred in my living room and on my porch and inside my accounts.
He didn't do that thing where people ask if I might have misheard or misunderstood. He asked if I had paper. I put the blue folder on his desk and undid the bent metal clasp and let the numbers line up in front of us. He ran a finger down a column. He asked me to slide the fresh printouts toward him, and then the bank's letters from years back, and then the notes in my wife's neat hand, where she had written "reminder" in the margin and underlined it once, and he read them like a man who knew that ink is a kind of witness. He cleared his throat and told me 3 things plain. First, he said, "You are allowed to close a door in your own house, even if your son is on the other side of it. Second, you are allowed to stop paying other people's bills.
Third, if anyone tries to question your competence to make those decisions, there are ways to put the question to rest that do not require you to shout or to cry. He told me to keep a log starting today. He slid a yellow legal pad across the desk and wrote the date in the top corner in clean block numbers. Write down what happens, he said, not how it felt. What was said, what time, who was there. If a thread is made, write its words, not your conclusion about them. He asked if I had a smartphone. I do, though it is not smart in my hands most days, and he suggested that if I felt reasonably safe, I could record conversations that took place at my own doorstep and in my own house. Laws vary state to state, he said, but a man inside his own home making a record of what is being said to him at his own door is rarely the villain of the piece. Then he said the part that unclenched something in my chest. There is a difference, he said, between disagreeing with the way a man handles his finances and proving that he is unable to handle them. The first is a family argument. The second is a medical and legal determination. If they mean to drag you down that road, we will meet them on it with the right boots. He told me to get an evaluation, today if possible, with a clinician who would ask me to show my memory, my reasoning, my adjustment to stress, the mundane mind work that keeps a life going. He said such reports exist for precisely times such as this. He promised nothing beyond what paper and process can rightly promise, that if I did my part calmly and completely, he would do his. While he photocopied what he needed, I looked around his office and tried to make sense of the objects that anchor a man. The Chip Team mug that says he has been disappointed by the same sports franchise for years and loves it anyway. The photo of a kid in a Little League jersey, a grin too big for the frame. The stack of client folders labeled in the same tidy hand, blue tabs and green tabs, and one red tab that surely means hurry. When he slid the copies back across the desk to me, his eyes met mine in a way that told me he understood this was not about numbers alone. It was about a man trying to stay himself in a house that had been turned into a wallet with walls. I walked out with the blue folder, heavier by a few pages and lighter by a little dread. The lobby had warmed up, or maybe I had. The summer noon had tilted its head toward afternoon, and the smell of cut grass had thickened into the hot sweetness that means the blades are drying. My truck seat had stored the sun and released it into my back as I climbed in, a good heat that said I hadn't done anything wrong by being alive at noon on a weekday and taking care of my name.
The clinic stood 2 blocks over, a low building with a good shade tree and a bench that had seen its share of waiting. The waiting room had the usual assortment. Posters about hand hygiene, a fish tank with 3 tired tetras doing slow circles, a stack of outdated magazines with headlines about last year's resolutions. The air smelled like antiseptic and mint gum. The woman at the desk wore scrubs with cartoon owls and asked for my ID with a voice that had already said the same sentence 100 times today. I slid my license across the counter and told her I needed a cognitive evaluation because my family was considering the kind of threat that makes a man come here rather than write a letter he will regret. She asked me to take a seat. Then she stood, walked through a door, came back, and said the doctor could see me in 20 minutes. The clock on the wall had a second hand that twitched, getting nowhere obvious, one red step at a time. A toddler with a grape juice mustache watched me solemnly and then offered me a peanut butter cracker with the gravity of a king offering a coin. I thanked him and let his mother rescue the cracker before his generosity could glue my fingers together. I breathed and blinked and watched the fish be fish. The blue folder sat on my lap with my granddaughter's drawing tucked under its lip, just enough to show the blue bottle's neck. The doctor called my name and led me down a hallway to a room that looked like any room where people are asked to reveal themselves without undressing.
It had a small desk, 2 chairs, a calendar that cared about nothing but squares and numbers, and a window with blinds tilted to let in light but not the outside. She looked about my age or a little younger, the kind of face that has been both gentle and firm long enough to make her good at both. She shook my hand and sat. She asked me why I was there, and I told her the short version because the long version takes too much water. The assessment did not feel like a test I could only fail. It felt like a walk through a house I know. She asked me to remember 3 words, and then asked me to draw a clock with the hands set to a specific time. She asked me to subtract 7s from 100 until the floor came up to meet my feet. She slid a page toward me with shapes on it and asked me to trace a pattern without lifting my pencil. She asked me to tell her what I would do if I saw smoke under a door. She asked me the date and the day of the week and the name of the place where we sat. She asked me to name animals that start with the letter F. She watched without judgment and wrote without hurry. We talked a little too, not just about the tasks. She asked me about my wife, and I told her about the blue bottle on the mantel and the way Light loves it in the late afternoon. I told her about the maple and about how my granddaughter draws the same house again and again, a small square with a triangle roof and always a window with something blue inside. The doctor nodded as if I were naming saints. She asked me what had been said at my door and what I had done this morning. I answered questions with dates and times because the lawyer's yellow pad had already begun to train me. When we were done, she turned the paper so it faced her and looked at it for a moment as if it could speak. Then she met my eyes. "You are competent," she said. Competent is not a word that sings, it is a word that builds. She said she would write a note on her letterhead with today's date and her license number and the plain statement that I was fully capable of managing my own affairs. She said if anyone wished to question that, they were free to schedule their own evaluation. She would stand by what she had seen. She asked if I wanted a copy now or if she should mail it. Now, I said, because paper changes the temperature of a room. She printed it and signed it and stamped it, and the stamp's thump had a satisfying weight to it, like a gavel in a small, honest courtroom. When she handed me the paper, it was still warm.
On the way out, the receptionist smiled for real this time and slid a manila envelope across the counter to protect the letter from the weather. I tucked it into the blue folder and felt the thickness change in my hands, the way a book feels different when a new chapter has been added, and you haven't read it yet, but you can tell it's there. The afternoon had softened by the time I stepped back outside. Clouds the color of cotton batting had wandered over and taken the edge off the sun, and the bench under the shade tree had a space that looked like it had been waiting just for me. I sat for a minute and watched a line of ants do their ant business along the edge of the pavement. A breeze moved through the maple leaves with the sound of a quiet applause. My phone buzzed once in my pocket, one text that I did not read. The sound did not leap at me the way it had in the kitchen. It just existed and then faded. On the drive home, the world came in little details that soothed the part of me that had been sanded raw. A man hosed his driveway and made a rainbow in the overspray. A girl on a bike had a stack of library books bungee corded to a rack, a precarious tower that listed with every turn and somehow held. A dog lowered his whole head into a bucket and came up smiling water. The light through my windshield found the same dust on the dash it always finds and made stars of it. I passed the diner where I always mean to stop for pie and never do, and the window was full of people being gentle with forks. I turned onto my street and felt that familiar thump in my chest a man feels when he sees his own house come into view. The maple lifted one branch like a hand saying, "There you are." The front steps were empty, the door closed, the porch still. I parked in the driveway and cut the engine. The sudden quiet fell like a sheet. I sat for a second and let it lie there. The air at the curb carried the smell of hot tar and someone's faint laundry. A bee fumbled in the rosemary by the steps and made the plant's scent leap into the heat. My key slid into the lock with its little metal sigh. I noticed the welcome mat had been nudged a couple inches off center. I bent and squared it because I can't help myself. The chain on the door lay flat and still. The answering machine on the hall table blinked its patient red eye. 1, 2, 3, 4. But I walked past it toward the kitchen because sitting had been most of my day and standing felt like a kind of victory. I set the blue folder on the kitchen table. The house gave me its small gifts, cool glass against my palm, the ice in a tumbler cracking to make room for water, the way the light slides along the countertop and finds the scratches and blesses them. I leaned my hip against the counter and let my back relax for the first time since the morning. The word incompetent drifted up out of wherever I had stuffed it and then drifted back down again, smaller. Knuckles tapped the side gate, just 2 quick knocks, not on the door but on the metal latch that keeps the slat from swinging open with the wind. I knew that rhythm. Lucy from next door has always knocked that way, a courtesy knock that says she's a neighbor, not an intruder. I walked down the short hall and clicked the deadbolt, then moved through the living room and out the side door. She stood there with her gardening gloves pushed into her back pocket and a smear of soil on her wrist like a bracelet. The scent of tomato vines came with her, sharp and green and good. "I'm not here to pry," she said, and there was enough truth in her voice to make me believe it. "I just heard a ruckus earlier and wanted to be sure your door is still your door." I told her it was. She tilted her head and looked at me the way someone looks at a tree after a storm to see which branches held. She asked me how I was, not like a person fishing for a line to bring back to someone else, but like a person who has time.
We sat on the back steps because the steps are where truth sits easier. She told me she'd watched my boy for years come and go in nice shoes with quick words, and she had kept her mouth shut because families are their own countries. She said the part she couldn't swallow anymore was how they handled me in public, not just the bills, but the little comments they let drop in earshot of the world. She said it wasn't that she wanted to take sides, it was that she wanted to be the kind of neighbor who puts a glass of water in your hand when your face says you've been out in the sun too long. I told her about the morning and the phone call and the restaurant and the front porch and the threat. I told her about the blue folder on the lawyer's desk and the yellow pad and the clinic and the doctor's steady hands. She listened without interrupting, which is a mercy rarer than money. She told me to call her if voices rise again at my door. She knows a retired officer who lives 3 blocks over and likes to help keep the streets civilized. She said she's got a grandson who can help me add a camera doorbell if that would make me sleep easier. I nodded, not committing to the camera, committing to the possibility of sleep. We didn't fix anything out there under the soft rasp of the maple leaves. We just let the world shrink to the size of a yard and 2 old people taking turns breathing. She stood at last and patted my shoulder once through my shirt, and the gesture had the exact right weight. Friendly, not pitying. She told me my tomatoes were late this year because I'm impatient with the hose, and I laughed because she was right. Then she walked back through the gate to her side, and I watched it swing and settle with the soft clank that tells a man he still lives among humans. Dusk was setting the table inside, laying down the blue-gray cloth that brings every evening. I went back in and flicked on the lamp in the living room, and the blue bottle on the mantel took a small piece of the light and made it better. The house smelled like paper and lemon, and the faint vanilla of the candles my wife used to buy in late summer. I stood in the doorway between the rooms and felt something like balance for the first time in a long time, the scale in my chest not clanging, just hanging there, true. It was only when I went to get the mail from the box by the front steps that I saw it. A plain envelope. No stamp, my name typed on a label, tucked between the slats of the gate at the exact height of a man's hand.
If this story is reaching you, leave your like and write in the comments your opinion about this story, and share it with your friends. The envelope was wedged between the slats of the gate, at the height where a person's hand rests when they mean to leave something and not be seen. The label had my name printed in block letters, the kind you get from a cheap office labeler, and no stamp, no return address, no postmark. The paper felt cool even in the late heat, and there was a faint chemical tang to the adhesive where it had been sealed in a hurry. The light along the porch steps had turned the color of old brass. Somewhere behind me, the refrigerator kicked on with its honest hum, and the maple above the yard gave one soft shiver, as if it understood the way my shoulders lifted.
I stood right there by the gate and slid my thumb through the flap. The seal gave with a sound like a match being struck. Inside was a thin stack of pages and nothing else. No note, no sticky square with a smug line, just paper that had been warmed by a human hand. The first page was a screenshot printout, the bank's header across the top, my account number with the middle digits masked out, and under it a list of actions with timestamps from that afternoon. There was an attempt to add a digital wallet token, failed, a request to reset security questions, blocked, a prompt to send a one-time code to a phone number I did not recognize, denied. The second page carried a different logo, a store-branded application for a card in my name that had been pre-filled with my address and date of birth, the kind of thing that rides the edge of fraud and calls itself pre-qualification. Someone had hit submit, and the bottom line showed pending verification. The third page was a small parade of tiny debits that had tried to march through a closed door and been turned back. 99 cents to verify a payment method, then another, then another. The ink said the attempts came within minutes of the restaurant's lunch rush. A hot cold wash ran across my chest, the kind that comes not with shock, but with recognition. This was not new behavior. It was the same behavior dressed in a new logo. The paper had the unromantic courage of facts. I carried the envelope inside and set it on the kitchen table beside the blue folder. I opened the folder and slid the new pages under the clip with the morning's printouts. The weight changed in that small but undeniable way that paper has when it grows by a quarter inch. I reached for the yellow legal pad the lawyer had pressed on me and wrote the date and time and a simple sentence about where I found the envelope and what it contained. I added the 3 lines from the screenshots, no adjectives, just the timestamps and the phrases the site had used. The act of writing steadied my hands. The sound of my pen against the paper was like a zipper closing on a winter coat. I took my phone and snapped photos of each page in the kitchen light, careful to frame the headers and the timestamps. The photos made that little shutter sound that still surprises me even after years of pocket computers pretending to be cameras. I attached them to an email to the lawyer, typed a subject line that didn't try to tell a story, new activity, see attached, and pressed send. Then I dialed the bank and waded through the matrix of robot voices to reach the desk of a person with lungs and a name. I asked to place a verbal password on all conversations about my accounts so that no one could call and rearrange my life with the right guesses. I chose a phrase my wife would have loved, a sentence only we had said to each other, and I wrote it on the yellow pad, and then copied it onto a small card I slid behind the photograph on the mantel. I asked to flag the account so changes could only be made in person with identification. The woman on the line spoke the kind of careful sentences people use when they work in a place that sees the same story many times a day. She clicked and sighed and told me it was done. When I hung up, the house felt hushed, waiting to see if I would keep going. I did. I sat with the phone and pulled up the 3 credit bureau sites one by one, the kind that turn your name into a product and sell copies of it to people you'll never meet. I froze my credit at each, wrote down the PINs, and tucked the slips into the blue folder behind a divider marked by my wife's old tab that says insurance.
The site sent me confirmations, and I printed those too. The printer warmed the room for a second with the smell of hot toner and clean plastic. I stacked the pages and straightened them with my palm and felt a steadiness return to my breath. Out back, the crickets started their evening stitching, and the blue bottle caught the last light like a lighthouse for one.
Sleep was not a broad river that night. It was a series of quiet pools. I lay on my side with one hand on the empty half of the bed and watched the maple shadow shift against the blind. I have learned over years of grief that the body can rest even when the mind is folded into itself. It didn't matter if I slept much. It mattered that I kept the train of actions moving, one car at a time, without letting fear stoke the engine. When the dark turned thin and the birds gave their first small comments, I got up, made coffee, and felt the day arrive without its usual weight on my neck. I was waiting in the bank's lobby when they unlocked the door. The tile still held the cool of the night, and the air had that faint newness that comes when a place has just had a vacuum run through it and the drip trays under the coffee machine are still empty. The manager had one of those faces that can manage most things. Firm mouth, kind eyes, a necktie the color of wet slate. He had helped me change passwords yesterday without making me feel like a child asking for instructions, and when he saw me, he came out from behind the counter as if we had the kind of relationship where he might put a hand on my elbow without offense. We sat at his desk, and he pulled his keyboard toward him and tilted the screen so I could see. He added notes that would travel with my name wherever it went inside their system. In-person changes only. No authorized users permitted. No replacement cards issued except at the branch with ID in hand. He set alerts to ping me when attempts were made to alter contact information or devices. He printed the list of flags and initialed it and stamped it with a small square machine that made the desk tremble. The stamp's impact made a good sound. A sound that said someone had seen me and agreed I was real enough to protect.
We had mentioned it yesterday as if it were a fog you could point at through a window, change the will. Today we brought it up close and put our hands on it. He asked me, again without judgment, what I wanted my legacy to do when I was no longer here to breathe for it. The language could have gone fancy. He did not let it. He proposed a simple structure that sits quietly inside many families. It is sometimes called an incentive, sometimes a condition, sometimes just plain common sense held in a document, a share that waits for proof. We drafted it so that any distribution to my son would be held until he could show 2 consecutive tax years of full financial independence, returns filed, income sufficient to cover his life without external subsidies, no past due balances hiding in the back of a drawer. The proof wouldn't be humiliating, it would be practical. Copies of W-2s or 1099s, evidence of rent paid without my account co-signing, utilities in his name and current, a small cushion sitting in a savings account that belonged to him. We said it so the proof could be presented to a trustee who had no stake in either of us beyond doing the job the paper asked it to do. The lawyer asked me who I trusted to be that trustee. I thought of Lucy with her honest eyes and her gardening gloves and her way of knocking that never demanded. I thought of the wear a role like that puts on a neighbor who just wanted to hand a glass of water over a fence. I thought of the accountant who has done my taxes for 20 years and knows the shapes of my numbers, but not my household's weather. We settled on a corporate trustee, not a person I'd be putting in harm's way. Firms do this like breathing, and sometimes distance keeps peace. The fees are not small, but neither is the cost of the alternative. The rest of the will remained simple, a modest gift to the community center where my wife used to volunteer and where my granddaughter once learned her first stitches, a line for the library because it had been our second church, a small bequest to my niece who has never asked me for a dime but has brought me soup when the flu knocked me down.
The lawyer typed, and I watched the words arrive on the screen, unadorned and heavy as bricks. He printed a draft for me to take home and read aloud to the only people who matter when a man talks to himself, the faces in the frames and the bottle that holds the light. We would sign in a few days with witnesses and a notary whose job it is to observe and acknowledge, not to opine. That timeline wasn't a stall. It was the right spacing of steps for a man who was moved too fast for too long toward the one door in his house that opened onto emptiness. I left with the draft and his handshake and the impression of the stamp still in my rib cage. Back at the house, the answering machine blinked a red number that had grown since morning, but not at the same frantic pace as yesterday. I played the messages not because I wanted to, but because a log is a log. There were the predictable ones, the disappointed sigh disguised as concern, the neighborly cousin I barely know suggesting we sit down like family and clear the air, by which he meant clear the debt. There was one from the restaurant manager using a calm voice to ask me to call him back. He had my son's version of the story and wanted to hear mine. I wrote his number on the yellow pad and left it there. The afternoon had softened with a bit of cloud, and the maple's leaves made a pattern on the floor like lace.
A knock came at the side gate, then the sound of it opening in the neighborly way, a hinge protest, a shoe on the path. Lucy stood there with her gloves in her pocket and a grandson beside her, a lanky boy with hair in his eyes and a box under his arm. The boy gave me the respectful nod that says a teenager recognizes an adult who doesn't expect him to be funny. Lucy announced the box without making it a production. It was a doorbell with a camera, the kind that lets a man see who is at his door before his day is rearranged. She said her grandson could put it in if I wanted, and if I didn't, he'd take it back to the store and buy more soda with the money. I nodded because there are gifts you accept not to fix a problem, but to remind the problem what it is up against, a neighborhood with hands. They installed it in under an hour, the boy explaining the app as if he were teaching me to tie a new knot. We connected it to my old phone. He showed me how to set it to record every time a body crosses the porch, how to store a clip, how to share one if I ever wanted to. Lucy supervised with a glass of lemonade and 3 stories about squirrels, each more dramatic than the last, and none of them with villains you could take to court. When the camera lit up and showed my own face looking back at me from the screen, something in me eased. It wasn't the machine that brought relief. It was the way the machine stitched me into a little web of people paying attention. When they left, the yard felt well watched by trees and by humans. The calls slowed for a stretch, as if the day had finally found its curb. The sliding glass door stayed open to let the kitchen breathe, and the smell of rosemary pushed against the screen, clean and brave. I took the will draft to the living room and sat in the chair that holds my wife's shape even now. I read the sentences aloud, each clause a plank I meant to nail down. The blue bottle listened. The light moved through it and threw a thin river of color over the page where my name sits plain and unaltered. I could hear my granddaughter's pencil from down the hall in the spare room where she keeps a little leave-behind set of markers and a jar of buttons. She was home from school. She muttered to herself the way artists do when lines are cooperating. It was late afternoon when tires whispered up my driveway. The sound was cautious, like a dog approaching a stranger with tail low. One car door opened and closed. No bell, no pounding, no window-rattling knock. A single shadow crossed the new circle in my phone's small screen, and the camera popped a soft chime. My son stood on my porch alone, shoulders rounding forward, hands empty. The camera showed me his face in the fisheye honesty those lenses give to the world. No angles to flatter, no chance to hide. The picture in my palm did not ask for anything on its own. It asked if I wanted to answer. I closed the app and walked to the door.
We did not speak at first, because the house had a few things to say on its own. The refrigerator sighed, the clock tapped, a truck rumbled 2 streets over and then took its noise away. He shifted on the couch as if to find the version of himself that used to belong in this room. I watched him without measuring and saw the boy I had bandaged and the teenager I had scolded and the man I had funded and the stranger who had stood on my porch yesterday with someone else's words in his mouth. He lifted his gaze and let it settle on the photograph of his mother above the mantel. He did not look away quickly. The silence bent around her, and then around him, and then came back to where I sat. I told him, in the simple lines a man can remember later, what had been done since yesterday, and what would be done next on paper that does not bend easily. I spoke about the flags on the accounts, and the freezes at the bureaus, and the cameras now keeping honest watch over the wood we oiled together years ago. I did not say the name of the restaurant. I did not talk about the envelope at the gate. These details belong to the log and the lawyer more than they belong to this conversation. I told him about the will in sentences that did not accuse. The conditions were not shame, they were scaffolding. If he wanted to climb them, they would hold. If he did not, they would stand there anyway, a shape he could not knock down by asking. He listened without cutting the air with his hands, the way he does when he is building a case on an empty lot. He kept his palms on his knees, as if he understood that sometimes hands must learn not to reach. When he looked at me again, there was something in his face that had been missing for a long time. Recognition. Not of the man who paid, of the man who lived. His mouth shaped a few words that did not ask for anything and did not promise anything beyond the next hour. I let them sit between us and do their small work. The part of me that used to reach into my pocket reached for the blue folder instead and tapped a quiet rhythm on its cover, a reminder to myself about what a father actually gives a son when he means to love him into adulthood. He stayed long enough for the room to change from afternoon to evening. The light leaned across the floorboards and reached up to touch the blue bottle one last time before slipping away. My granddaughter kept to the spare room, her pencil making steady music. She came out once to refill her water and glanced between us with the wise caution of a child who has learned where not to stand. She set a folded square of paper on the table beside the folder, a fresh drawing of the house with its square windows, and in one of them a blue shape that could be a bottle or a sky. Then she drifted back down the hall and closed the door without sound. When my son rose to go, he did not make a show of it. He stood, looked at the photo again, and reached for the doorknob. He paused as if the metal were warmer than he expected, and then opened the door himself. The porch accepted him neutrally. The camera chimed softly in my pocket. He stepped out into the last light and walked to his car with the measured pace of a man counting something invisible to the eye. The engine started. The driveway made its small gravel hush. The car turned left at the end of the street, and the maple settled its leaves as if to say, that was that, for now.
The house exhaled. The answering machine's red eye sat still. The kitchen drew me in with the promise of its small chores. I rinsed 2 glasses I had not gotten around to and stacked them upside down to dry. I wiped the countertop and smelled the lemon oil rise up with its ordinary mercy. I slid the will draft back into the blue folder and rested my palm on it, feeling the cardboard give just a little and then hold. The blue bottle collected what remained of the light and returned it in a thread that ran across the table and touched the yellow notepad where today's entries sat plain and patient. In the spare room, a pencil stopped scratching and a chair creaked, and a girl hummed a sound that had no words and did not need them. Outside, the street moved into its evening quiet, a rhythm I have known longer than my own breath, and the house, my house, held its shape around me. My hand was still resting on the blue folder when the quiet settled so fully I could hear the ice melt in the 2 upturned glasses on the rack. The lemon smell from the cloth hung soft over the counter. The blue bottle on the mantel caught what was left of the evening and threaded it across the table to the yellow pad where my notes waited in straight lines. I lifted my phone, not because a message had come, but because a decision had. I typed to my son without ceremony. "Come tomorrow at noon. Bring Dana. We will talk at the house." The sentence was plain as lumber. His answer came quick, a single word that didn't try to be anything other than what it was. Okay. The rest of the house did the things that end a day. My granddaughter closed the door to the spare room and the pencil stopped its rasp. The hallway clock kept time without needing an audience. The street outside went to its evening quiet, a cat crossing a lawn like a smudge of night. I put the folder away and rinsed the cloth and hung it where my wife always hung it, folded twice on the oven handle in a neat, soft square. Sometimes fidelity to small forms is how a person holds their shape. I turned off the lamp by the mantel, and the blue bottle turned itself off with it, the last thread of color going transparent and then gone. Morning came in through the kitchen window with the same light as always, streaked by the maple leaves and the faint tracks of a spider's night work. Coffee made its confident noises, the little hiss and gurgle that says a man will live through this hour, and the smell walked across my kitchen like an old friend with clean boots. I wiped the table once, not because it needed it, but because habit is a way to make space for a difficult hour. I set out 3 glasses and a pitcher of water with lemon slices floating like moons. I put the blue folder square in the center of the table and laid the doctor's letter and the bank flags and the will draft inside it in the order I meant to use them. I took the little camera screen on my phone for a test ride and watched the porch bloom to life in fisheye and then go still. The doorbell chimed its shy sound when the mailman walked by out of habit, and the clip stored itself automatically, a quiet witness in my pocket. At 11:57, tires rolled on my gravel and the chimed circle lit. A single car, the same one that had come and gone so differently yesterday. The lens bowed their faces a little, but not enough to hide what they carried there. He looked like he hadn't slept much and had learned something in the hours he'd been awake. She looked as people look when a story they relied on breaks its own spine. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and went to the door. The wood was cool under my palm. I opened it before their knuckles made contact.
We did not stand on the porch with voices that could drift. We came into the kitchen, the room that makes everyone smaller and more honest if you let it. The refrigerator hummed. The lemon slices ticked softly in the glass against the curve of the pitcher. The blue folder waited where I had placed it. I asked them to sit. I stayed standing a beat longer, not to dominate, but to remind my legs they worked. Then I took my chair with the back to the window, where the maple made lace over everything. I did not ask about the restaurant. I did not ask about the messages. I didn't put their mother's name in the room. I said we were going to be clear. I said I would talk first, then listen. I said we would let paper do the heavy lifting because paper doesn't raise its voice or forget what it said yesterday. My son nodded. Dana kept her eyes on a spot just past my shoulder, like a student pretending to track a bird to avoid the teacher's question. I reached for my phone and opened the app to the clip from 2 afternoons back. The camera gave me their bodies in the doorway, the way shade broke over their shoulders, the way anger changes posture. It gave me her voice exactly as it had been when she turned it sharp and said the thing that had cut the air of my own kitchen. "If you don't open this door and stop this nonsense, we'll get a lawyer and have you declared incompetent." The words sounded flatter on playback, less performative, more like a piece of wood you could put on a scale and measure. I set the phone on the table and pressed play and let the clip run. It was not long. When it ended, silence took its seat in the 4th chair. My son looked at the phone and then at me. He did not reach for it. Dana's shoulders pressed forward and then released. She blinked, 2 careful blinks that looked like she had sand in her eyes. She started to say it wasn't what it sounded like, and stopped herself halfway through the first excuse and let the sentence die. The refrigerator clicked off, and the room waited to see who would fill the space. I opened the folder and slid the doctor's letter out. I read the date and the name and the sentence that mattered most. The patient is fully competent to manage his own affairs. The stamp's thump lived again in the room when my finger touched the embossed seal. I did not flourish the page or point to my signature like a trophy. I set it down in front of them the way you sit down a plate in front of a person who claims there is no food in the house. Then I took out the bank flags and the credit freezes and the list of accounts that were now bound in ways that did not rely on my memory or my patience. I explained them calmly, the way my wife used to explain a recipe to someone who had never cooked. Not as if they were stupid, but as if they had never been required to use those skills. Then I folded back the flap over the last set of papers and told them about the will. Not to threaten, not to sting, but to place the terms in the center like a table where we might eat something honest. I explained that a share with his name on it would sit patiently until proof appeared that he could carry his own life for more than a season. I named the proof: 2 tax years, income covering income, no ghost bills, a small cushion growing in his own name. I told him there would be a trustee who had no stake but doing the job cleanly, and that the trustee's job was to check boxes, not to judge hearts. The rest of the will, I said, would go to the places that had kept our family upright. The center where his mother had folded chairs and poured lemonade for card games with people who needed company. The library that taught our granddaughter the trick of lining words up until they made a bridge she could walk across.
Dana finally met my eyes then. Whatever she might have said about how unfair it was to set a test for a grown man, choose not to stand next to what lay on the table. She asked, voice smaller, if I intended to press charges for the applications and the attempts on the account. I heard the quotes she made with her mouth. The kitchen has no room for quotes. I told her I intended to log everything, share what I needed with the lawyer and the bank, and draw a line here. I said if the line was crossed again, not misunderstood, not bumped into, but crossed, then the room we were in would change its purpose. I said I did not want that for any of us. She looked down at her hands and picked at a fingernail until the small crescent of polish lifted. My son spoke without leaning forward, which is how I knew it was him and not the part of him that wants to sell his version of events. He said he had moved their things yesterday into a smaller apartment.
He said he had canceled memberships that made no sense when bills sat with their arms folded and their eyebrows raised. He said he had found their wedding china in a box in a closet and realized he had been saving it for a day that never comes, and maybe using the good plates now and then was a way to stop pretending he was someone else's idea of a man. He said he had filled out a rebudgeting worksheet that made him feel like he'd been walking around with his shoes on the wrong feet for years and had only just realized why his back hurt. He didn't ask for money to help with the transition. He didn't offer me receipts as proof. He talked like a person who'd walked through a door and wasn't going back to check if it had closed behind him. I listened and let the words sit. Then I told him the truth I had failed to say for years, simple as a nail tapped straight. I wanted a son who visited because he loved me, not because my wallet answered faster than his courage. I told him that starting now, if he came in that door, he would be to sit and eat and talk about weather and baseball and the way the maple always loses its leaves too fast in October, not about payments or deadlines or the emergency that smells like perfume. I told him that starting now, if he needed a thing that mattered, if the world did what it sometimes does and knock a man flat, I would listen as a father and respond as a man who would learn the difference between rescue and theft. He did not promise to make it easy. He promised only to try, which is the only promise worth hearing. Dana's eyes had gone red in the rims. She said she was ashamed. The word did not sound like a line in a play. It sounded like a thing that had cost her to pick up and say out loud. She said she didn't know how to be poor. I told her she wasn't poor. She was unpracticed. I told her being unpracticed is not a moral category. It is a habit, and habits start with the first day. I told her my wife had stood in this kitchen once and shown me how to soak a pot so the burnt part lifted by itself with time and hot water, and that I had thought the trick was magic until I realized the trick was patience. Dana laughed once, a breath-short laugh that didn't become anything else, and then she nodded. She said she would learn. Whether she meant it the way you mean, I'll drink more water after a doctor's appointment, or the way you mean it when you change a tire yourself for the first time and realize you could have been doing it all along, I could not tell. The room didn't need me to know the answer yet.
We sat a while like that. 3 people and a blue bottle and a folder full of paper and a pitcher sweating its clean lemon rings on the table. My granddaughter padded in and stood by my chair and leaned her small weight against my shoulder for 1 second and then left us to it, the quietest benediction I have ever received. I poured water and we drank. Glass on wood has a sound I think my wife would have approved of. Clear, without drag, exact. The clock in the hall offered its quarter hours like small coins. The kitchen held us together the way it always had, with ordinary mercy. Consequences do not arrive with trumpets. They are modest. They show up in what people do and stop doing. My son pulled a pair of cards from his wallet and set them on the table, those plastic rectangles with my name across them that the bank had already killed. He said he wanted to leave them here anyway. He slid across a small ring of printouts, too. New lease, streaming service cancellations, an insurance payment made on time, and I wrote the date beside each in the yellow pad as a way of teaching my hand to trust what my ears were hearing. Dana said she would return something she had borrowed without asking. She didn't spell it out, and I didn't make her, and she would send me a text later that day to let me know it was done. I told her to text once and then to let the rest be quiet. We didn't wallow in apologies. I have learned there is a point beyond which sorry becomes its own addiction. I accepted what made sense to accept and set aside what needed time to prove itself. I said I would send them a copy of the will draft so no one would be surprised by a paper read in a room without me in it. I said I would not be their enemy. I said I would not be their wallet. Both sentences can stand together if you let them. They nodded like people who had just learned a new word and wanted to try it out on their tongues without breaking it.
When the next pause came, thicker than the ones before, my son looked at his mother's photograph and said her name for the first time since he walked in. He didn't ask what she would have wanted. He said he knew. He said it like a man reading something he had written himself and not dared to read until now. The sound of her name in his mouth pulled a thread in the room tight and then let it relax. I felt something unclench under my sternum that had been holding on for longer than my lungs knew how to measure. They stood without rushing. Chairs make a particular sound when feet and decisions lift at the same time. I walked them to the door. On the porch, the sun threw heat you could see, a shimmer over the steps. The doorbell camera watched us without getting bored. Dana turned back once before she hit the walk and said thank you in a tone that didn't ask for a reply. My son put his hand out, palm up, the way he used to when he wanted me to put a coin there for the gumball machine by the grocery exit. I shook it. His grip was neither hard nor limp. It was his grip, the one I had taught him when he was 13, and I told him you look a person in the eye and say your name like you mean it. He said my name now, not Dad, and it meant something different. Then he said Dad too, and it meant what it had always meant before we let the other mean more. They went to the car and left. No slamming, no spray of gravel, no last words tossed over a shoulder. Just a car joining the street and becoming part of the town's noon sound. A modest exit, fit to follow a modest beginning.
Inside, the house returned to itself. The lemon on the table smelled like brightness you can drink. The glass left rings that wiped up easily. The blue folder lay quiet and full. I slid the doctor's letter and the flags and the will back into their sleeves. I wrote a final line on the yellow pad with the time and the sentence, "They came, we spoke, terms laid, boundaries kept." I put the pad under the folder and closed the clasp. Its dull click sounded like something clicking into place inside my chest, too. I carried the folder to the mantel and stood with the blue bottle between my hands, not touching it, just letting the coolness of the glass move through the air. I took my granddaughter's drawing from the corner and propped it against the base. In her picture, the house was a square with a triangle roof and a blue shape in the window. Today, it looked more like sky than glass. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt like a man who had put his tools back in their drawer after finishing the work the day demanded. The maple outside threw a little shade through the window, and the shadow of leaves trembled over the photograph of my wife, turning her smile into something that moved again. I breathed in, and the room breathed back. I am old enough to know that peace is not a place you move into and sign a lease. It is a practice. It is the way a man stands in his own kitchen and says yes to what keeps him whole and no to what takes pieces without asking. It is the way a father loves a son without feeding the thing that eats the son alive. It is a blue bottle catching light in late afternoon, and the steady tick of a clock, and the sound of a child humming in the next room. Today, all of that belonged to me again. Love without boundaries isn't love. It's erasure. Real love teaches a grown child to stand and leaves the door open when he does.